The morning sun streamed through the tall, arched windows of the Millbrook County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches that had witnessed decades of small-town justice. The air was thick with tension and the familiar scent of old leather and furniture polish that seemed to permeate every courthouse in America. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in September, and Courtroom 3 was packed beyond capacity with an unusual mix of spectators: elderly black residents, middle-aged white business owners, young Latino families, and curious teenagers who had skipped their first period to witness what everyone in town knew was going to be a reckoning. At the defendant's table sat 78-year-old Samuel Washington, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap, wearing the same navy blue suit he'd worn to church every Sunday for the past 15 years. The fabric was beginning to show its age, small pulls in the wool and sleeves that had been carefully mended by his late wife's steady hands. But Samuel wore it with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent 45 years delivering mail through rain, snow, and scorching summer heat. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his posture straight despite the arthritis that made every movement a small act of defiance against time itself. Across the courtroom, Officer Derek Thompson strutted toward the witness stand like a peacock displaying his plumage. His uniform was immaculate, crisp creases that could cut glass, brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, and boots that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. At 42, Thompson had the build of a man who spent more time at the gym than he did reading police procedure manuals, and the swagger of someone who believed his badge gave him authority over truth itself. His blonde hair was slicked back with enough gel to survive a hurricane, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had never met prey he couldn't break. Thompson's hand rested casually on his duty belt as he took the oath, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had testified in dozens of cases over his 15-year career. But this wasn't just any case, and Samuel Washington wasn't just any defendant. This was the culmination of months of growing tension in Millbrook, a small southern town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where Officer Thompson's pattern of targeting elderly black residents had finally reached a breaking point that would shatter his world forever. The charges were simple enough on paper: theft of merchandise valued at $1.47 from Johnson's Family Grocery, a candy bar and a pack of gum, according to Thompson's report. Simple shoplifting that should have resulted in a citation and a court date. But what had actually happened on that humid Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks ago was far more complex, far more sinister, and far more revealing of the systematic abuse that had poisoned this small community for over a decade. Samuel had been shopping for his weekly groceries, the same routine he'd followed every Tuesday since retiring from the Postal Service 8 years ago. He moved slowly through the narrow aisles of Johnson's, his arthritic fingers carefully selecting items from his handwritten list: bread, milk, eggs, the basics that sustained a man living alone on a fixed income. At the checkout counter, he'd paid for everything with exact change counted out from a small leather coin purse his wife had given him for their 50th wedding anniversary, 2 years before the cancer took her away. But Officer Thompson had been watching. He'd been parked outside Johnson's for 20 minutes, ostensibly on patrol, but actually waiting for an opportunity. Thompson had developed what he called his instincts over the years, a sixth sense that seemed to activate whenever he saw certain types of people in certain types of situations. And an elderly black man shopping alone had triggered every one of those instincts, regardless of Samuel's spotless reputation or the fact that he'd been shopping at Johnson's longer than Thompson had been a cop. The courtroom gallery buzzed with quiet conversation as Judge Margaret Coleman called the session to order. At 63, Judge Coleman had presided over this courtroom for 12 years, and she'd seen enough of Thompson's cases to recognize a pattern that made her deeply uncomfortable. Too many elderly defendants, too many minor charges, too many cases where the evidence seemed suspiciously thin. But Thompson was a decorated officer with commendations from the mayor and the sheriff, and judges in small towns learned to pick their battles carefully. The state versus Samuel Washington, Judge Coleman announced, her voice carrying across the packed courtroom. Officer Thompson, you may begin your testimony. Thompson rose from the witness stand with theatrical confidence, his chest puffed out like a soldier reporting for inspection. He'd done this dance hundreds of times before, the authoritative posture, the commanding voice, the absolute certainty that his word would be accepted without question. In his experience, juries believe cops, especially when those cops were testifying against people who looked like Samuel Washington. "Your Honor," Thompson began, his voice projecting to the back of the courtroom. "On September 3rd, at approximately 2:30 p.m., I observed the defendant, Samuel Washington, engaging in suspicious behavior at Johnson's Family Grocery." He paused for dramatic effect, letting his eyes sweep across the gallery like a spotlight searching for criminals. "I witnessed Mr. Washington concealing merchandise on his person and leaving the store without paying for said items." A collective intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Samuel's attorney, a young public defender named Jennifer Martinez, who had graduated law school just 2 years ago, scribbled notes frantically. She'd reviewed the case file a dozen times, looking for holes in Thompson's story. But the officers' reports were detailed and confident. What she didn't know yet was that Thompson had been perfecting the art of creative writing in police reports for over a decade. "Can you describe the specific items you allege were stolen?" Jennifer asked during cross-examination, her voice steady despite her nervousness. This was her first case involving Officer Thompson, and she'd heard whispers from other defense attorneys about his reputation for embellishing facts. Thompson's smile was razor-thin and cold. A Snickers bar and a pack of juicy fruit gum. Total value $1.47. Not much money to most people, but theft is theft, regardless of the amount. His eyes found Samuel's across the courtroom, and his expression shifted to something approaching contempt. Some people think they can take whatever they want, whenever they want it. Age doesn't excuse criminal behavior. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Samuel's hands remained folded in his lap, but something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, but a deep sadness that came from recognizing a familiar tune played in a different key. He'd heard these songs before in different decades, from different men in different uniforms. The melody of assumption, the harmony of prejudice, the chorus of authority used to silence dignity. But what Officer Thompson didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, as he sat there spinning his web of lies and assumptions, was that this courtroom was about to become the stage for the most spectacular reversal of fortune in Millbrook's history. The old man he was preparing to humiliate with his practiced routine of mockery and condescension had allies Thompson had never noticed, respect he'd never earned, and a community behind him that was finally ready to say enough. The candy bar Thompson claimed Samuel had stolen was still sitting on the counter at Johnson's, paid for and forgotten in the commotion of a false arrest. The security footage that would prove Samuel's innocence was waiting on a hard drive that Thompson had never bothered to review. And in the gallery, 47 members of the Millbrook community were about to teach Officer Derek Thompson that sometimes justice doesn't come from a judge's gavel or a jury's verdict. Sometimes justice comes from ordinary people who refuse to watch quietly while evil masquerades as authority. But before we see how this courtroom became the site of the most beautiful display of community solidarity you've ever witnessed, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like this show what happens when bullies think they're untouchable. And trust me, the moment this entire courtroom turned against Thompson will give you chills. Let's see how one old man's quiet dignity exposed a corrupt cop's true nature and changed an entire town forever. To understand why what happened next in that courtroom was so extraordinary, you need to know who Samuel Washington really was, and more importantly, who Officer Derek Thompson thought he was dealing with. Because the collision between perception and reality was about to create a shockwave that would ripple through Millbrook for years to come. Samuel Washington had been born in 1945 in a two-room sharecropper's cabin 15 miles outside Millbrook, the youngest of 6 children whose parents worked cotton fields that belonged to other men. His earliest memories were of his mother's hands, cracked and bleeding from picking cotton under the merciless Alabama sun, and his father's quiet dignity as he counted out coins at the company store, knowing the math never quite added up in their favor. Samuel learned early that the world was designed to break people who looked like him, but he also learned something else from watching his parents. That dignity was something you carried inside yourself, something that couldn't be taken away no matter how hard others tried. At 18, Samuel had done what thousands of young black men did in the 1960s. He joined the military, trading the cotton fields of Alabama for the rice paddies of Vietnam. He'd served 2 tours as a communication specialist, earning a Purple Heart when shrapnel from a mortar round had torn through his left shoulder during the Tet Offensive. When he'd returned home in 1969, he discovered that the country he'd bled for still didn't consider him quite equal enough to drink from the same water fountains as the white soldiers who'd served beside him. But Samuel Washington was nothing if not persistent. He'd used his GI Bill benefits to finish high school and then attended community college, studying at night while working construction during the day. In 1973, he'd taken the Postal Service exam and scored in the top 5%, earning a position that would define the next 4 decades of his life. For 45 years, Samuel had walked the same routes through Millbrook, delivering mail to mansions and trailer parks with equal care, learning the names of dogs and the birthdays of children, becoming a fixture in the community that transcended the racial boundaries that still divided the town in subtle but persistent ways. Everyone in Millbrook knew Samuel Washington, the elderly white widow on Elm Street who relied on him to carry her heavy packages to her door, the young Latino mother on Oak Avenue who looked forward to his daily smile and gentle inquiry about her children, the black families in the Riverside neighborhood who considered him an uncle, a grandfather, a symbol of what was possible when dignity met determination. In 45 years of federal service, Samuel had never been late, never missed a day without calling in, never received a single complaint about his conduct or professionalism. Officer Derek Thompson knew none of this. In Thompson's worldview, Samuel Washington was just another elderly black man who probably didn't belong in a grocery store in the nicer part of town. Thompson had developed his expertise in criminal behavior through what he called pattern recognition, though others might have called it something far less charitable. In his 15 years on the Millbrook Police Department, Thompson had become the unofficial specialist in what the department euphemistically called quality of life enforcement, the kind of policing that focused on minor infractions, loitering charges, and the sort of petty harassment that could make life miserable for people who couldn't afford good lawyers. Thompson's personnel file told a story that his superiors had chosen to ignore. 37 complaints in 15 years, most of them filed by elderly residents, most of them people of color, most of them dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. The pattern was clear to anyone who bothered to look, but Thompson had powerful allies in the department. Chief Robert Hawkins was Thompson's former high school football coach, and Sheriff Jim Bradley had been Thompson's father's hunting buddy for 30 years. In the insular world of small-town law enforcement, connections mattered more than complaints. The incident at Johnson's Family Grocery had begun like so many others in Thompson's career, with assumptions that hardened into facts without ever encountering evidence. Thompson had been parked across the street from the grocery store, ostensibly watching for speeders, but actually scrolling through social media on his phone, when he'd noticed Samuel walking slowly toward the entrance. Something about the elderly man's deliberate pace had triggered Thompson's suspicions. In his experience, people who moved that carefully were usually up to something. For 20 minutes, Thompson had watched Samuel through the store's large front windows, his imagination creating a narrative that had nothing to do with reality. When Samuel paused to read labels, Thompson saw someone casing merchandise. When Samuel counted change at the counter, Thompson saw someone calculating what he could afford to steal. When Samuel's arthritic hands fumbled slightly with his wallet, Thompson saw the nervous behavior of a guilty man. By the time Samuel had completed his transaction and headed for the door, Thompson had already decided what story he was going to tell. Maria Santos, the store manager who had worked at Johnson's for 8 years, would later testify that she'd known Samuel as a customer for nearly a decade. He came in every Tuesday at exactly 2:15 p.m., bought the same basic groceries, and always paid with exact change counted out from a small leather coin purse. Samuel was the kind of customer store managers loved, polite, patient, and never demanding. He'd even helped Maria's elderly mother navigate the aisles when she'd visited from Mexico the previous year, translating her broken English into gentle requests for assistance. But Thompson had never bothered to ask Maria about Samuel. He'd never reviewed the security footage that clearly showed Samuel paying for every item. He'd never checked the receipt that Samuel had carefully folded and placed in his wallet. Thompson's investigation had consisted of watching Samuel walk to his car, then following him for 3 blocks before activating his lights and sirens for what he would later describe in his report as a high-risk stop of a known shoplifting suspect. The arrest had been performed with theatrical precision in front of Samuel's own home, where neighbors had gathered to watch in shocked silence as Thompson had loudly announced the charges while forcing Samuel's hands behind his back with enough force to aggravate the old man's arthritis. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, Samuel's 82-year-old neighbor, had tried to intervene, explaining that Samuel was a respected member of the community who had never stolen so much as a penny in his life. Thompson had threatened to arrest her for interfering with police business. Dr. Jennifer Liu, Samuel's physician for the past 12 years, had examined him the following day and documented bruising on his wrists consistent with excessive force during handcuffing. The medical report noted that Samuel's arthritis made any twisting of his hands extremely painful, and that the position Thompson had forced him into during the arrest could have caused permanent nerve damage. But Thompson's report described Samuel as combative and resistant, requiring necessary force to ensure officer safety. Reverend Michael Johnson of the Mount Olive Baptist Church, where Samuel had served as a deacon for 20 years, had visited Samuel the evening after his arrest and found a man more bewildered than angry. Samuel couldn't understand why Officer Thompson had been so certain of his guilt, so unwilling to listen to reason or examine evidence. "I tried to tell him I had the receipt," Samuel had said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had encountered this particular kind of blindness before. But he didn't want to see it. What Samuel didn't know was that Thompson had made a career out of not wanting to see evidence that contradicted his assumptions. The officer's case clearance rate was impressive on paper, largely because he had mastered the art of charging people who couldn't afford to fight back. Elderly defendants, undocumented immigrants, young black men with public defenders. They were Thompson's specialty because they were statistically unlikely to have the resources or credibility to challenge his version of events in court. But Thompson had made a critical miscalculation with Samuel Washington. He had assumed that an elderly black man would follow the script Thompson had written for him, accept the charges, plead guilty to avoid jail time, pay the fine, and disappear back into whatever corner of society Thompson believed people like Samuel belonged. What Thompson had failed to recognize was that Samuel Washington had spent 78 years learning how to maintain his dignity in the face of exactly this kind of institutional prejudice, and that 45 years of federal service had taught him something about the difference between legitimate authority and its corrupt imitation. More importantly, Thompson had failed to notice the 47 people sitting in the gallery behind Samuel, each of them with their own story about why they had come to court that morning, each of them carrying their own memories of Samuel Washington's quiet kindness, and each of them finally ready to speak the truth that Thompson had spent his entire career trying to silence. The truth was about to set them all free, but first it was going to destroy the man who had made a living by burying it. Officer Thompson settled into the witness stand like a king ascending his throne, his uniform crisp enough to cut paper, and his confidence radiating through the courtroom like heat from a furnace. He'd testified in this same courtroom dozens of times over the past 15 years, and the routine had become as comfortable as his morning coffee. State the charges, describe the evidence, watch the defendant's shoulders slump in defeat. Simple, efficient, and profitable for a department that measured success in conviction rates rather than community trust. Judge Coleman looked up from her notes, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Officer Thompson, please describe the events of September 3rd for the court." Thompson's voice filled the courtroom with practiced authority, each word precisely enunciated like an actor who had performed the same role so many times he could deliver his lines in his sleep. "Your Honor, at approximately 2:30 p.m., I was conducting routine patrol in the vicinity of Johnson's Family Grocery when I observed the defendant, Samuel Washington, acting in a manner consistent with shoplifting behavior." Jennifer Martinez, Samuel's attorney, scribbled notes while watching Thompson's body language. Something about his posture troubled her. Too confident, too rehearsed, like a politician delivering talking points rather than a police officer recounting facts. She'd handled dozens of shoplifting cases in her 2 years as a public defender, and honest cops usually showed at least some uncertainty when recalling specific details. Thompson spoke as if he were reading from a script. "Can you elaborate on what you mean by shoplifting behavior, Officer Thompson?" Jennifer asked during her cross-examination. Thompson's smile was thin and condescending, the expression of a teacher dealing with a particularly slow student. "Well, counselor, when you've been doing this job as long as I have, you develop certain instincts. You learn to recognize the signs." He gestured vaguely towards Samuel, who sat quietly at the defendant's table, his weathered hands folded in his lap. Suspicious movement patterns, nervous behavior, the way someone carries themselves when they're planning to commit a crime. "And what specific movements did you observe Mr. Washington make that indicated criminal intent?" Thompson's pause was almost imperceptible, but Jennifer caught it. For just a moment, his confident facade flickered, like a television screen with poor reception. The defendant was moving slowly through the store, examining merchandise for extended periods, looking around to see if anyone was watching him. Classic surveillance behavior that thieves use to identify opportunities. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. Several elderly residents exchanged glances, their expressions showing a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. Samuel Washington moved slowly through every store because he was 78 years old with arthritis. He examined merchandise carefully because he was living on a fixed income and needed to compare prices. He looked around because his hearing wasn't what it used to be, and he wanted to make sure he wasn't blocking other customers' access to the shelves. But Thompson was just getting started. As he warmed to his performance, his voice took on the tone of a man explaining simple concepts to children. "You have to understand, Your Honor, that theft isn't always about need. Sometimes it's about opportunity. Sometimes it's about the thrill of getting away with something. And, unfortunately, we see this pattern frequently with certain demographics." The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Demographics. Jennifer felt her jaw tighten as she recognized the coded language that had been used to justify discriminatory policing for decades. Beside her, Samuel remained motionless, but she could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing had become more deliberate and controlled. "Officer Thompson," Jennifer said, her voice carrying a sharp edge, "are you suggesting that Mr. Washington's age or race influenced your decision to suspect him of criminal activity?" Thompson's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Of course not, counselor. I don't see color when I'm doing my job. I see behavior, and the behavior I observed was consistent with someone preparing to commit theft. The defendant's personal characteristics are irrelevant to the facts of the case." But even as Thompson spoke the words, his eyes were telling a different story. They kept drifting to Samuel with an expression that contained equal parts disdain and amusement, as if the old man were a particularly entertaining specimen in a zoo. Thompson had spent so many years justifying his prejudices with official language that he'd convinced himself his own lies were truth. "Please describe what you allegedly witnessed Mr. Washington steal," Jennifer continued. Thompson's chest puffed out as he launched into the centerpiece of his testimony. "I observed the defendant concealing a Snickers candy bar in his jacket pocket while standing near the candy display. He then proceeded to the chewing gum section, where he concealed a pack of juicy fruit gum in the same pocket. Total retail value, $1.47. "And you're certain of what you saw?" "Absolutely certain. I have 20/20 vision, 15 years of law enforcement experience, and I was positioned with a clear line of sight to the defendant's actions." Thompson's voice carried the absolute conviction of a man who had never been successfully challenged in court. "I watched him look around to make sure no one was watching, then quickly slip both items into his pocket." What Thompson didn't mention, what he would never mention, was that his clear line of sight had been from across the street, through 2 sets of windows, while he was simultaneously scrolling through Facebook on his phone. His 15 years of experience had taught him that juries believed confident cops over confused defendants, especially when those defendants looked like Samuel Washington. and his 20/20 vision had somehow failed to notice the security camera that had recorded Samuel's entire transaction, including the moment he'd paid for both items and received his receipt. Jennifer pressed on, sensing weakness in Thompson's story. Did you continue to observe Mr. Washington after you believe he concealed these items? Yes, I followed him to the checkout counter, where he purchased other items but failed to pay for the concealed merchandise. He then left the store and proceeded to his vehicle, at which point I initiated the traffic stop and subsequent arrest. The lies flowed so smoothly from Thompson's mouth that even he seemed to believe them. This was the power of institutional authority, the ability to transform fiction into fact simply by speaking it with enough confidence from the right position. Thompson had learned long ago that the truth was whatever he said it was, as long as he said it while wearing a badge. But something in the gallery was shifting. The murmur of conversation was growing louder, more agitated. Judge Coleman had to tap her gavel twice to restore order, her expression showing the first signs of concern about the direction this testimony was taking. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, Samuel's 82-year-old neighbor, was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd known Samuel for 15 years, had watched him care for his dying wife with a tenderness that had brought tears to her eyes, had seen him shovel her driveway every winter without being asked. The idea that this gentle man would steal candy from a grocery store was so absurd it was almost laughable, except that Thompson was telling these lies with such conviction that she worried the judge might actually believe them. Reverend Michael Johnson sat 3 rows back, his clerical collar feeling suddenly tight around his neck. As the pastor of Mount Olive Baptist Church, he delivered dozens of eulogies over the years, but he'd never felt the kind of rage that was building in his chest as he listened to Thompson systematically destroy the reputation of one of the finest men he'd ever known. Samuel Washington had spent 20 years as a deacon, had organized the church's food drive every Christmas, had personally delivered meals to shut-in members during the worst of the pandemic. The idea that he would steal anything, much less $1.47 worth of candy, was not just false, it was obscene. Maria Santos, the store manager, was taking notes on a small pad, documenting every lie Thompson told. She'd already contacted her district manager about providing the security footage, but the legal process was slow, and she was watching a good man's character being assassinated with carefully crafted fiction. Maria had immigrated from Mexico 8 years ago, had built her life in Millbrook through hard work and determination, and she understood exactly what Thompson was doing because she'd seen it before, the way some people in positions of authority use their power to diminish others who couldn't fight back. Dr. Jennifer Liu sat near the back of the courtroom, her medical training allowing her to observe Thompson's testimony with clinical detachment. She could see the classic signs of a practiced liar. The micro-expressions that didn't match the words, the slight tension around the eyes that indicated cognitive dissonance, the way his hands gestured just a fraction of a second before his words, as if he were conducting an orchestra of deception. As Samuel's physician, she knew about his arthritis, his careful attention to detail, his almost obsessive honesty about even minor medical symptoms. The man Thompson was describing bore no resemblance to the patient she'd been treating for 12 years. But Thompson was far from finished. As Jennifer's cross-examination continued, his demeanor began to shift from professional confidence to something darker, more personal. The respectful facade he'd maintained during his direct testimony was starting to crack, revealing the contempt that had always lurked beneath the surface. "Officer Thompson," Jennifer said, "did you speak with the store manager before making your arrest?" "That wasn't necessary. I witnessed the crime with my own eyes." "Did you review any security footage?" "Again, not necessary. I saw what I saw." "Did you ask Mr. Washington if he had a receipt for his purchases?" Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, his voice took on an edge of irritation. "I don't need to ask criminals for receipts, counselor. When someone commits a crime in front of a police officer, the appropriate response is arrest, not a friendly chat about paperwork." The word criminals hit the gallery like a physical blow. Samuel Washington, war veteran, federal employee, church deacon, beloved neighbor, had just been casually dismissed as a criminal by a man who had never bothered to learn his name before arresting him. The temperature in the room seemed to rise several degrees as 47 different people processed the casual cruelty of that statement. Jennifer felt her own anger building, but she forced herself to maintain professional composure. Mr. Washington is presumed innocent until proven guilty, Officer Thompson. Referring to him as a criminal before the court has reached a verdict is inappropriate. Thompson's laugh was sharp and bitter. Presumed innocent? Counselor, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know a shoplifter when I see one, and I know the difference between honest citizens and people who think the rules don't apply to them. The mask was beginning to slip, revealing the ugly truth beneath Thompson's professional veneer. But the worst was yet to come, because Thompson was about to make the mistake that would transform this routine court proceeding into a moment of reckoning that would echo through Millbrook for years to come. He was about to show the entire community exactly who he really was. Thompson's composure was unraveling like a cheap suit in the rain. As Jennifer's questions grew more pointed, his responses became increasingly hostile, his professional mask slipping to reveal the sneering contempt he'd kept hidden beneath 15 years of false courtesy. Officer Thompson, Jennifer pressed, you stated that Mr. Washington appeared nervous. Isn't it possible that a 78-year-old man with arthritis might move carefully through a store for legitimate health reasons? Thompson's laugh was cold and mocking. Oh, come on, counselor. Let's not play games here. We both know what we're dealing with. His eyes found Samuel across the courtroom, and his voice took on the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. This isn't about arthritis or age. This is about pattern behavior that I've seen hundreds of times before. What pattern behavior? People like Mr. Washington who think they can take advantage of store owners because they believe their condition makes them above suspicion. Thompson gestured dismissively toward Samuel. The confused elderly act, the slow movements, the I forgot excuse when caught. It's textbook shoplifting behavior disguised as harmless confusion. The gallery erupted in angry whispers. Thompson had just suggested that Samuel was faking his arthritis, exploiting his age, and deliberately appearing confused to facilitate theft. The cruelty of the accusation was breathtaking, turning Samuel's legitimate physical limitations into evidence of criminal cunning. But Thompson wasn't finished. Emboldened by what he perceived as control of the narrative, he leaned forward in the witness chair, his voice carrying the authority of someone delivering indisputable truth. Your Honor, I've arrested dozens of elderly shoplifters over the years. They all use the same playbook, move slowly, act confused, hope people feel sorry for them. Mr. Washington here is just better at the performance than most. Thompson's smirk was cruel and satisfied. He probably figured his military service would buy him sympathy, maybe get him off with a warning. But theft is theft, regardless of how old you are or what uniform you used to wear. The silence that followed was deafening. Thompson had just mocked Samuel's military service, suggesting that his Purple Heart was nothing more than a prop in an elaborate shoplifting scheme. The insult cut deeper than any physical blow, striking at the core of Samuel's identity and sacrifice. Samuel's hands trembled slightly, not from fear or guilt, but from the enormous effort it took to maintain his dignity while listening to this systematic destruction of everything he'd worked for, fought for, and lived for over 7 decades. Thompson, completely oblivious to the building storm around him, pressed his advantage. These people learn to work the system, Your Honor. They know exactly which buttons to push, which sympathies to exploit. Mr. Washington probably has this routine down to a science. The folded hands, the quiet voice, the respectful demeanor. It's all calculated to make people think he's harmless. These people. The phrase hung in the air like a neon sign advertising Thompson's true beliefs. Not elderly shoplifters or repeat offenders. These people. Everyone in the courtroom understood exactly which people Thompson meant. Mrs. Hayes was gripping her purse so tightly her arthritic fingers had gone numb. Reverend Johnson's face had darkened with an anger that 20 years of preaching forgiveness couldn't contain. Maria Santos was writing furiously, documenting every word of Thompson's character assassination. Dr. Liu was shaking her head in professional disgust at the medical ignorance and cruelty on display. But Thompson's final insult was yet to come. "Frankly, Your Honor," Thompson said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I think Mr. Washington is exactly where he belongs, in this courtroom, answering for his actions instead of hiding behind his age and playing the victim. Maybe a conviction will teach him that stealing is stealing, no matter how pitiful you try to look while doing it." The explosion was immediate and unanimous. 47 voices rose in outraged protest, 47 people who had finally heard enough, who could no longer sit silently while evil masqueraded as justice. And that's when Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, all 82 years of her, stood up. Can you believe the audacity of this racist officer? The way Thompson just mocked Samuel's military service and called his dignity an act shows exactly what kind of person hides behind that badge. If you're loving the story of how an entire community came together to expose a bully, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone's prejudice backfire this spectacularly? Because what happens next, when Mrs. Hayes stands up, will restore your faith in humanity. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes rose from her seat with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had lived through 8 decades of watching bullies assume they could silence truth with authority. Her arthritis made the movement painful, but her resolve made it unstoppable. At 82, she had buried a husband, raised 4 children, and survived the kind of hardships that forge steel from flesh. She was not about to let Derek Thompson destroy a good man's reputation with lies. "Excuse me, Your Honor," Mrs. Hayes said, her voice cutting through the courtroom's chaos like a blade through silk. Despite her age, her words carried clearly to every corner of the room. "I have something to say about Samuel Washington." Judge Coleman's gavel had been raised to restore order, but something in Mrs. Hayes's tone made her pause. This wasn't an outburst of emotion. This was the voice of someone who had reached a moral breaking point and refused to retreat. Thompson's head snapped toward the gallery, his face flushing red with indignation. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The gallery cannot just—" "Officer Thompson," Mrs. Hayes interrupted, her steel-gray eyes fixing on him with the intensity of a laser. "You have spent the last 20 minutes telling lies about one of the finest men I have ever known. Samuel Washington has been my neighbor for 15 years. He shoveled my driveway every winter after his wife died. He carries my groceries when my arthritis acts up. He sits with me on my porch when I'm lonely, never asking for anything in return." Her voice grew stronger with each word, decades of accumulated dignity flowing through her like electricity. "You call him a thief? Samuel Washington returned $20 to me when the grocery store gave him too much change. You call his service record a prop? That man took shrapnel in Vietnam defending the same country that allows bullies like you to wear a badge." Thompson started to respond, but Mrs. Hayes wasn't finished. "I have watched that man for 15 years, Officer Thompson. I have seen his character when he thought no one was looking, and I have seen yours today." The silence that followed was profound, but it lasted only seconds. Because as Mrs. Hayes stood there, her moral authority radiating through the courtroom like sunlight, something extraordinary began to happen. Reverend Michael Johnson stood up. Then Maria Santos. Then Dr. Jennifer Liu. One by one, like dominoes falling in reverse, the gallery began to rise. 47 people, representing every demographic in Millbrook, standing together in a silent declaration that Thompson's reign of lies was ending. Thompson's confident smirk evaporated as he watched his authority crumble in real time. His head swiveled frantically between the standing figures, his brain struggling to process what was happening to his carefully constructed narrative. "Sit down," he barked, his voice cracking with panic. "This is a courtroom, not a—" "This is exactly what a courtroom should be," Reverend Johnson said quietly. "A place where truth stands up to power." As the courtroom stood in unified defiance, Maria Santos stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, I am the manager of Johnson's Family Grocery. I have security footage that proves Mr. Washington paid for every item in his possession." Thompson's face went white. "That's impossible." I saw him steal. You saw nothing, Maria interrupted, her accent thick with emotion. Because you never looked. You made assumptions based on the color of his skin, not the truth of his actions. Judge Coleman's voice cut through the tension. Ms. Santos, do you have this footage available? Yes, Your Honor. On my phone. Maria held up her device. It shows Mr. Washington approaching the counter, paying for a Snickers bar and juicy fruit gum with exact change, receiving his receipt, and leaving the store. Total transaction time, 43 seconds. The courtroom fell silent as Maria connected her phone to the court's display system. The black and white security footage filled the large screen, showing Samuel counting out coins, handing them to the cashier, receiving his change and receipt, and walking calmly toward the exit. Thompson watched his career die in real time. 43 seconds of truth destroying 15 years of lies. Dr. Liu spoke next. Your Honor, I've been Mr. Washington's physician for 12 years. His arthritis makes quick movements painful. He moves deliberately because he has to, not because he's planning crimes. Reverend Johnson's voice filled the courtroom with quiet authority. Samuel Washington has been a deacon at my church for 20 years. He organized our food drives, delivered meals during the pandemic, and never missed a Sunday service. The idea that this man would steal candy is not just false, it's obscene. One by one they spoke. Neighbors, customers, friends, 47 witnesses to Samuel's character. Each testimony a nail in the coffin of Thompson's credibility. Thompson tried desperately to interrupt, to regain control, but his voice was drowned in a tide of truth that had been building for 15 years. This is all irrelevant. I know what I saw. Mrs. Hayes's voice cut through his protests like steel. You saw what your prejudice told you to see, Officer Thompson. Nothing more. Judge Coleman's gavel finally fell, but not to restore order, to deliver justice. All charges against Mr. Washington are dismissed immediately, she announced. Officer Thompson, you will face a full investigation for perjury, false arrest, and violation of Mr. Washington's civil rights. Thompson's world collapsed in that moment. Within hours, he was suspended without pay. Within days, he was terminated and facing federal charges. Within weeks, he was a cautionary tale told in police academies across the country. But the real victory wasn't Thompson's downfall. It was what happened next. The Millbrook Police Department implemented new training programs. Community oversight committees were established. Body cameras became mandatory. Samuel Washington was appointed to the Civilian Review Board, ensuring that Thompson's pattern of abuse could never happen again. Mrs. Hayes organized weekly community meetings where residents could voice concerns about policing. Maria Santos expanded her store's community programs, creating a space where neighbors of all backgrounds could gather safely. Dr. Liu began offering free health screenings for elderly residents who couldn't afford regular medical care. Samuel Washington returned to his quiet life, but now he carried something new, the knowledge that when evil tried to silence dignity, an entire community would stand up and say enough. The candy bar and gum Thompson claimed were stolen? They were donated to the local food bank, along with Thompson's final paycheck, by order of the court. Sometimes justice doesn't come from judges or juries. Sometimes it comes from ordinary people who refuse to watch quietly while bullies destroy innocent lives. Sometimes it comes from an 82-year-old woman who decides she's too old to stay silent, and a community that remembers what it means to stand for truth. Samuel Washington proved that dignity is its own defense, and that the truth, supported by courage, will always triumph over lies backed by badges. Samuel Washington's story shows us what's possible when a community decides to stand together against injustice. One racist officer thought he could destroy a good man's reputation with lies and mockery, but he learned that some people's character is too strong to break, and some communities are too unified to intimidate. What strikes me most about this story is how Mrs. Hayes sparked a movement just by standing up and speaking truth. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person with enough courage to say what everyone else is thinking, and a room full of people ready to follow their lead. If stories about justice, community solidarity, and people standing up to bullies inspire you, you'll want to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We cover cases like this every week, showing how ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to stay silent. Next week, we're diving into the case of the prosecutor who thought she could intimidate a young defense attorney, until she discovered that public defender was actually the Attorney General's daughter conducting an undercover investigation into judicial corruption. Trust me, her reaction when the truth came out was absolutely priceless. Remember what Samuel Washington and his community proved that day in court. Dignity, truth, and collective courage will always triumph over prejudice and abuse of power. Sometimes justice needs a little help from everyday heroes willing to stand up and be counted. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.